I really appreciate you being the guinea pig on the first Petie Project podcast.
Oh yeah,
And yeah, I discovered you on Mark Bell's Power Project and was just really intrigued with your training philosophy, kind of your life philosophy, as well as your perspective on pain. I feel like it's a big area that's misunderstood by a lot of people. And I feel like you really kind of hit the nail on the head with what I've been going through and kind of my own pain journey over the last few years. So if you just want to start with, what's kind of your sports background, what's your training background, and also your education and clinical practice.
sure. My sports background is football. Um, that was originally kind of what I focused on the most, and I went to college on a football scholarship, and that was where my heart was at that time, and it did a lot for me in terms of education. I went to Nickel State University on a football scholarship in Thibodaux, Louisiana, and
Okay.
so I left home, and my home is D'Iberville, right next to Biloxi, Mississippi, and it's right here on the Gulf Coast. And so I left and went over there. And now I think about it, my first really encounter with more high level performance or strength and conditioning was Coach Cheeks. Was a small guy we had at Nichols, and I shouldn't say small guy. He was huge guy, but he's
Mm,
small stature. Um, but huge heart, huge mind, And man, he really pushed it in terms of teaching me Olympic lifting because we didn't learn anything really in high school. In fact, we learned
sure.
how to hurt us. We learned how to hurt ourselves.
Yeah, that's usually the case.
Like the
Like
way we
just
did
enough to be
power
dangerous.
clean. Oh, I mean, we learned how to move weight. It wasn't right, and
Sure.
so he stopped me and retaught me everything. And I remember having to relearn power cleans and hang cleans, and I was just doing it wrong. I was widening my base. I wasn't really dropping under the weight. Um, and he was a big Olympic lifter, and we had a good relationship. So um, that was my first real experience to learning proper form, proper technique, and feeling like like it was legit. And then played there 4 years. Obviously, you have to push yourself a lot, experience a lot of injuries, and I was
What
pretty
what were some
clear.
of the what were some of the injuries that you had while you were there?
Oh man, I had a hamstring injury that was just one of the worst things ever. I'd putting on like 15 pounds over a summer and worked harder than I've ever worked. I was squatting like 650 pounds for
Oh
reps.
wow.
Like I don't even know what my one rep max was because I never really found it. Um, but that was a crazy summer. I was just pushing, 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 and we were maxing out twice a day, or twice a week.
Oh
I'm
man.
sorry. On Mondays and Fridays, we would pyramid 10, 8, 6, 4, 2, and we'd finish with as much weight as we could lift every single week.
Wow. Brutal.
Yeah, it's kind of dumb, but it worked. It worked. We
Sure.
found a little pyramid scheme, but what it worked in getting stronger, but it didn't help me in terms of didn't, I was over conditioned in a way where I kind of put on muscle, but I probably should have been running a lot more and really I ended up as soon as I started getting really fatigued and we're back to running sprints and everything, I pulled a hamstring beginning of my sophomore year, and it hampered me up for like 6 weeks right at the beginning of the season. And
Oh man.
yeah, it was bad. I had a bad inversion sprain. I got rolled up on really bad one time, and that had me out for a while. I remember I was non-weight bearing for like a couple weeks because it was like pretty bad. And I started having dreams of running. Like I missed running so much that I started having
Yeah.
dreams of running, and that was crazy. I never had that happen before. But I just remember like yearning to run again, and I never had that feeling before. But I remember that, and
Were the dreams lucid? Were you
yeah,
aware you were aware you were dreaming?
one, a couple times, once or twice, at the like right before I started running again, it was like I had this dream. I was running over like cobblestones in like a river, and then that one was lucid. I was like, holy crap! And I started
Oh
taking
wow.
off. doing all kinds of cool stuff. But yeah, that was great. And then um, separated shoulders. Um, that was probably one of my the biggest injuries was AC joint injuries. And then other than that, um, I've got really lucky. I haven't had a knee injury, even though I'm extremely knock-kneed. I'm like Jenny Valgum to the fullest. Like it's pretty. Like I can't even put my feet together. There's like
Wow.
if I put my knees together, there's like 5 inches between my feet.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So, but believe it or not, I think it actually predisposed me to be better at playing linebacker and moving lateral because it kind of puts your base of support out there a little bit.
Sure. Sure. Yeah,
Weirdly enough,
that's
I feel like
interesting.
it's somehow it helped me, and I
I
haven't had a knee injury.
I could see
You
that.
know.
Like it almost, yeah,
Yeah.
puts you in an athletic stance to move side to side.
Yeah.
That's really
Yeah. Just
interesting. So,
put your lateral support out
yeah.
there. You know.
So
And what was the last part of the
football,
question?
post football. So that's kind of like your athletic background. But what about training and clinical practice?
The way I got in personal training was I didn't have a certification, like I said, but I knew I was comfortable working with people. I knew I could help people, and
Right.
I knew I wanted to be a physical therapist at that point. So I was doing my applications, and I was a fitness consultant. And I told this guy Eddie, I was like, Eddie, what do I need to do? He was the head trainer. So what
Mm.
do I need to do to start training people? Because this $8 an hour you're paying as a fitness consultant is kind of not going to cut it. So I would, the gym had just opened, and so he's like, man, if you get clients, he goes, you just go get some certification and you can start training. So I literally went home that night and I found like some $39 online certification.
There you go.
And I got it, and I
I
brought
love
it
it.
to him the next day. I was like, "Here, I got it," and then I just started picking up clients left and right. And but before I left, I had about a dozen clients, and that kept me busy all afternoon. I'd stay working until 10 o'clock some nights.
Wow.
It was long days, and I turn around, do it again. But I knew it was all temporary. And when I got accepted to PT school, it was a really big deal because I guess I put myself in the corner where I don't ever do things the easy way. I tend to make things a lot harder. but
Yeah.
but anyhow, I got offered I got a letter or at least I got a letter to do my interview there, and then from that point, I knew I would be in, and I spent a lot of time doing extra things, visiting, and I had all the staff figured out. Like I knew who they were. I knew who the mission spoiler was going to be. I drove up there probably 4 or 5 different times leading up to that time period, and yeah, I got in, um, and once I got in, I finally realized what it meant to study and what it meant to really care. When I started caring about this stuff, and I was like, I want to be good at this because it's going to be the rest of my life.
Right.
So I really finally figured that part out where I could sit in the library for 4 or 5 hours and just be just excited to be there for I didn't know that was even possible.
Yeah.
And um and so I went through that, and that was uh that was a great experience. And obviously you go through a lot during those time periods and learn a lot about yourself. And we had 4 different clinical rotations experiences where we get to go different 8 weeks to different clinics, and you get to go to different settings and see and kind of learn more about yourself. And I went to James Andrews Institute in Gulf Breeze, Florida for my third rotation, and he's the top orthopedic surgeon in the country and has been
Oh,
for years, for decades. And so that was really cool. It was obviously it's a physician on practice, so it's not like what I do today, but it was a first opportunity to encounter like high level professional athletes and to have a part in their care. But also you see that there's drawbacks even at the highest level in terms of where you can I could see balls getting dropped all
Yeah.
over the place. Jamal Charles was there at the time. He had just really busted on the scene. I think he just signed like a $25 million contract right before this. He had tore his ACL,
Mhm.
and they had him on a treadmill with like a 15-degree extension lag in his surgically repaired knee. They had letting his knee stiffen up, and he had a bit of a flexion contracture where he couldn't straighten his knee,
Mhm.
and so he was being allowed to kind of run with really poor form, and I was surprised. I was really surprised because I just thought that would be so scrutinized at that level, and
Sure.
but believe it or not, the guy that was managing his care and treating him was just another therapist, and for that guy, he didn't really feel like it was a problem to let a person run with a 15-degree extension lag. Whereas I know for a fact you're going to develop patella tendonitis, and that's just a fact. That's just what happens. If you accumulate those reps, you're going to cause a problem, um, especially when the joint can't achieve its terminal extension where it has to be whenever the heel strikes. But that was something that opened my eyes because I just realized that it doesn't really matter where you are, where you go, where you're at, what you do. There's going to be the perception is not always going to match the reality, and I wanted to be the best that I could be, and all I can really influence is what I do. And I started working with, I think I worked a little with Brian Arakpo, uh, Jamal Charles. They had a couple kind of, I guess you could say, not such big superstars that I had a chance to work with. There's people on special force teams, um, and then there
So
was some. Actually, Chandler Jones, John Jones's brother, who played for. He's a really good defensive end. He was there at the time. But yeah, so that was my big experience into high level performance. And then next door they had Exos, which was kind of a sports performance center. So they had a performance PT there who was kind of a manual therapist with more sports specific uh, um, physical therapy techniques for the people that are actively doing what they're doing.
right.
My PI there was Hunter Starks, and he actually has a little performance center down there in Gulf Breeze now. He was really impactful. I didn't like him as a person, and I'll be honest, now I do. But he wasn't very like nice. He picked on me a lot and made it kind of tough on me. But now I appreciate him, love him to death, because that helped me a lot. I needed it in a way, and he didn't care about what I knew. I was there to learn from him, and it was the
Mhm.
first time I experienced somebody that didn't care to know anything about me, from me. He was just there
Sure.
to share information with me, and in reality, that was the best thing for me. But it kind of bothered me in the beginning.
Yeah,
I'm
it's a
like,
little
oh,
weird.
yeah, but um, he was good, man. He introduced me to FMS. That was really the first time I heard about Greg Cook or
Mhm.
Kelly Starrett. It was the first time I really looked at the FMS system in terms of how you can use a functional screening system to identify uh, will injuries occur, and and you could score this subjectively. I thought that was super interesting, and I knew right away that was going to be a part of my practice to some degree, or
Mhm.
that kind of thinking, and and that was big, and really how in terms of the hips and the core. Those standard positions, especially the lunge position, and then thinking about how the body's compensating, that was really where I got my first experience was over there. And then after leaving there, I worked in a clinical practice that was just locally, and it was an outpatient kind of neuro-based population, a lot of referrals from neurosurgeons and things of that
Mhm.
nature. And I didn't have a ton of athletes at that time. I was really working with I've always tried to work with the community.
Sure.
Um, and then my goal, like as far as Neolife, was really to get it established as a clinical practice to the extent that I could, and it was kind of taking care of things financially to where I could focus more on the things that I really love, which is sports performance and performance optimization. But in the same
So
token, I'm still who I am, so I still do those other things. But I can have a little more freedom now.
so you went into PT knowing that you wanted to roll it back into sports performance at some point.
Oh yeah,
That was the main driving factor was the sports performance.
yeah. And the clinical practice for me was it's still important, but it's still where my heart really lies. But um, so I started a company called Neolife Physical Therapy
Mhm.
and Wellness, and grew it to three locations. We have about 40 employees,
Wow.
and we started in 2015. And yeah, we just been hitting the ground running, and we're making big changes on the Gulf Coast. We're at we see between 600 and 800 people a week collectively.
Wow.
So we're definitely influencing things on a bigger scale, and it gives me an opportunity to be me more in mentorship, in developing therapists, and developing smarter systems that can really where we can help more people, and do it more efficiently.
Nice. So this next topic I want to hop into is what really caught my attention on the first podcast I watched with you, and that's the topic of hypersensitization. This can
Hmm.
live under a bunch of other names. I don't know if you'd classify it the exact same, but it's pretty similar as far as mind body pain syndrome, tension myoneural syndrome, neuroplastic pain, TMS. There's a bunch of different, wordings for this kind of sensation in the body that's going on, and I know it can express in a lot of different ways, different forms of pain. It can be anxiety. It can be, diagnosis like fibromyalgia. So, what will you speak on hypersensitization? Some kind of what that is, how you think that develops, and where you go with a patient or an athlete that is presenting these kind of symptoms.
Well, it's different for different people. Obviously, you have like chronic regional pain syndrome, which is sometimes going to be like a local effect of that. It's just basically a total out of proportion response, because it's hypersensitized, and what happens is you get these these exaggerated efferent signals that are basically alarming the body as to us, of as if like the homeostasis is really lost in the system, and it's a neurochemical imbalance, but it's tied to a lot of things. Your brain, your thoughts, your emotions are all neurochemical responses, and it can get out of whack. And unfortunately, our lifestyles and our environments are we don't move anything like as a culture, as a nation, as a work. I mean, as humans these days, we just don't move nearly as much or as often as our ancestors did, and we're not forced to in a lot of ways. So I think that's a big part of it. I think our diets and the inflammatory factors in our diets have play a part in the larger occurrence of these things. I think the psychologically, the way we cope with our problems, definitely play part into it. The support we have, the acceptance we have in our community and to our homes, even, and the hierarchies that we are established in our lives, that plays part in these things. And we're talking about physical pain that is manifested into uh, different levels of disability that may not match structurally, but their
Sure.
subjective experience is sure as heck what it is. And what I've always just chose to give those people full respect, and really try my best to not dismiss them like I've noticed others doing. And dismissing a person in that condition is only it's a cop out from a provider standpoint, because then you could just say, you know, I didn't try, therefore I didn't succeed, which is a loser mentality.
Sure.
Um, so my first cases I got in well, the serious ones that I was able to manage was in my fourth rotation as a therapist in Marathon. I was doing a clinical in Marathon, Florida, down by the Florida Keys at Island Physical Therapy, Cami Dominga, and it was like a neuro and peds clinic. So it was like geriatrics and peds, but it was neuro kind of based. She was awesome, and they were good people. It was her and her husband who was like he was, what's he? He was tough. He was from Europe, some Eastern European, but she was cool. He was cool, and we saw so many cool things. And that's where I really learned the basics of how the nervous system can be really dysfunctional, whether it was developmental delays. But then when looking at the pain syndromes, I noticed that a lot of the fibromyalgia cases would have thyroid disorders and would also be super sedentary. They would um, they would be in abusive relationships. They would be in abusive homes. Their
Hmm.
husbands or spouses uh, would talk to them, poorly. They would be in a dysfunction. There would always be dysfunction in the state and quality of their life and the relationships that they're in. Um, there would be maybe a daughter or multiple, kids that they don't talk to or communicate to, or maybe the kids on drugs, and and there's always bigger problems playing out. There's avoidance that's going on that's dramatic, and whether if I had to see, like for instance, a CRPS case of this young woman that was a swimmer in decent shape, and once she had hurt her ankle, she went into such a protective mode, and she went to a doctor, and the doctor said, well, don't put any weight on it whatsoever, but there was no fracture. It
Yeah.
was just a dumb doctor giving bad advice,
This
and
sounds very familiar.
right, and so she literally floated this thing around using two axillary crutches for 2 weeks, without any splint or device to like maintain the integrity of the joint position. And so
Hmm.
she's literally sitting there in full plantar flexion, dangling around her foot. And so obviously, as soon as she goes to put her foot down, she already had a plantar flexion contracture to the point where her heel couldn't even come down. And obviously she was a little high strung, and
Hmm.
that's the common case. Just like I noticed on frozen shoulders, which are super hypersensitized. The most common population tended to be like soccer moms that had like 2 or 3 kids and was managing just crazy amounts of activity, and were going here and there, and it was like it's like I noticed that the control and the inherent inability to release control was one of the main factors in all these conditions. And so, really trying to focus on different mechanisms and methods of inhibition, of using manual techniques to help you desensitize areas. Uh, Started to use breath work as a mechanism to downregulate the nervous system, and then really get interested in other mechanisms that potentially can influence the autonomic nervous system. I've become obsessed with that, and starting Neolife neuroorthopedics is really our game because of this, and this is where I found to treat hypersensitization, central
Hmm.
sensitization. We have to do things that affect the autonomic and the central nervous system. We can't get hung up on these local effects, and forget that if this knee patient, I'm not really working on down regulating them, and getting them into a state that they can tolerate these joint mobs, or these exercises or activities. It's it's based off of, for instance, I could grab you right now and I could tell you we're going to the top of a mountain and not say anything else. Well, let's just say you have an inherent fear of heights. Well, you're going to spend more time in apprehending and speculating on what's going to happen based off of your prior knowledge of what your fear is, and you're going to speculate and live an entire reality based off of your fear before I even pick you up to do the
Right.
thing, right? And so this is how our minds play with us. And so when you think about, well, what's that happen? There's cortisol being released, right? There's chemical effects. There's physiologic effects that are occurring in the body that are having a downstream effect that are going to affect everything. Um, by the time you know you get picked up, you're already in a state of
In a knot.
you're in a knot before you even, and it's not based off of one thing that you did
Right.
other than it's all what you did in your own mind.
Yeah,
And
the
our own
anxiety
minds are,
of projecting those
yeah,
fears into the future.
exactly. And our minds are traps for our egos, really. And I do think that a part of the a part of the condition is a part of imbalance with the relationship with the ego. And I think it's
For sure.
and I think that's controversial. And that's even saying it, I got to be careful because I don't want to offend anybody. But
Well,
I
I
really
can
think,
relate to that deeply because, being an athlete, coming from a very physical background, when my pain started manifesting as knee pain, I go to the physical body, what's going on? Have I ever trained? Have I done this or that? And then there is the ego that's tied to, I'm an athlete. It's kind of like these labels that you give yourself where when you're not able to perform athletically and do the things you love, it really puts you in a low place and it becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy of
mm,
trying to figure out the pain, which causes more pain, and then you become obsessed with it. So I totally relate to that message with the tying to the
and there's a
ego and definitely.
control element there, right? Because what is the ego there for? In a sense, to kind of protect our psyche, to like tell us to. It's for like to tell our identity that that we're cool, like telling ourselves that we're still important or relevant. It's
Right.
all kind of silly. As the older I get, the sillier I think it is. But and the thing is, I have been and will be in those same ego traps at some point in my life again, maybe by the end of today. Uh, but how quickly can you see it, acknowledge it, and kind of turn the tide? And when it comes down to the body and pain, avoidance is always going to be our enemy. And if there's anything that we're doing, if there's things within our lives that we're doing where we're avoiding things that we need to do, then inevitably it's going to cause major dysfunction and loss of homeostasis. And recovery from any injury is basically a cycle of whether it's an injury or whether it's, you know, you got to think you know, we are a fascial matrix. We're suspended. Our bones are suspended. We're not stacked. We got to think about our health and the way we operate differently, and think of the fascial matrix that's kind of shaping and containing and supporting your body. Um, it's You could see how quickly it's all connected and how quickly one problem can spread to another, and also how often problems are looked at improperly. Your knee pain, well, they're looking at your knee. It's not your knee. It's something going on either above or below, that area. And there's the first time I realized that somebody's like some issues they were having in the at least what I could see and find at that point in my career was tight hamstrings, and I could see how that was causing their neck pain.
Yeah.
And first time you kind of start making those correlations, you realize that we are wrong, and the only thing stopping us from getting closer to right is our own egos as medical professionals. It's our own inability to collaborate and to be vulnerable with other health professionals and and trying to add more information, tools, and insight. Um, our defensiveness to information itself is a part of the problem. And I've learned that whether it's patients or whether it's colleagues, I've if you're defensive to information, that is inevitably a part of this pathology we're talking about, right?
Mhm.
Because information itself should not elicit an emotional response of think of pain as a sensation that the body wants to withdraw from, right? It's in a sense it's a sense where the discomfort has reached a level that my body intuitively wants to withdraw and remove itself from that, right? And that's pretty universal regardless of where, and that can be emotionally too, I think. So I think that's the part of where we got to think about our mind, body, and the emotions and the way that we manage how are we managing information, whether the information is coming through words or through sensations. It doesn't matter. And I think we have to become more tolerant and resilient in realizing when we are being defensive to information, whether it be sensation or whether it be through words, right? We should, as adults and grown people, we should have the ability to develop mechanisms to take things less personal, and to make less assumptions and to speculate less in our own lives and worlds, and to tell the truth at all costs, right? And this is
Yeah.
all coming from Don Miguel, the Four Agreements. It's the most basic strategy in life. Work your hardest. Always do your best. You know, these are simple things that we know, and I think ancient wisdom is even known. Um, and I think it's a part of what me and you are doing, and probably even a part of our mission in life is collectively is just to help people live better lives and to see less suffering in the world and to help people, in any capacity we are able to do so. And the worst thing we can do is say, based off of our title, our specialization, my certification, that I can only do this, right?
Right.
The idea is that you are a human helping other humans, and you're spreading love in the world, and that's all we really have at the end of the day.
For sure. One thing as it relates to hypersensitization that I really like, that you had said earlier on the Power Project podcast is the pathology is the fact I'm focused on these things. I
Mm.
think that's extremely powerful because going back to always looking for this physical, tissue pathology in the tendon or the muscle or whatever it is, but it's really the obsession
Over,
psychologically with the sensation, with the symptom that is the most crippling.
becomes consuming and diversion. And I've stumbled upon some of these techniques because you're that's how a lot of cool things happen. Um, and I'm sure there's been information out there on pain science for years. I think it evolved. A lot of that information's kind of evolved throughout my career. But the idea is that diverting attention from that's the commonality with all these pain syndromes is an over obsession of the sensations within the body.
Absolutely.
But you know, emo- we're too focused on our feelings, right? As much as our feelings are important, we have a loss of homeostasis on the other side too, where people are. You could be disconcerted with your feelings, and that could be a huge problem, which is a
Hmm.
problem, and you see it a lot. And when I say feelings, I mean feelings in the body, right? Sensations in the body, or emotions. They kind of they can blend together easily. But the idea is that we can be on the wrong side of the track. We got to find the middle, and we got to find the balance, and we can't be over obsessed with our feelings, and but we can't be under obsessed either. Diverting attention from specific points of stress and pain in the body are really, it's miraculous on how you can teach people to now use those same sensations, distribute uh, and really focus on distribution of functional patterns that are really highly connected into complex neural networks that are kind of pre-hardwired for us. And we could jump right into utilizing what we know to be kind of pre-existing natural pathways and leveraging those things in a way where we can help people build a connection to movement instead of a defensiveness to it. And
So
I'll give
as
you an
an
example.
yeah, as an
Good.
athlete, what's a let's say you're an athlete that because I feel like this is a massively underserved market as well. You've got the athletes in their 20s, 30s, and 40s that have, lingering pain from whatever they think called, whatever that trigger was, and that's like always their excuse, like, oh my shoulder, oh my knee, whatever it is.
That's
if
why I didn't
if
go
you
pro.
if you come to this realization that you are hypersensitive, what is a good starting point as far as these practical down regulation techniques, as well as using kind of diversion as a strategy to get you into movement where you're not focused on that, pathology?
I mean, it depends on the case, I'll say, um, because you have different levels of dysfunction. You can have that fibromyalgia case with the woman with the thyroid disorder that looks like Cushing syndrome. She's been on corticosteroids and methylprednisone chronically. They're running out of options in terms of how to treat her. Her entire interstitial um, space is just, she's bound with fluid all the time, always just puffy, right? Um, so the lymphatics are backed up. The 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 venous system is backing up in the lower extremities, and it's all the effects of chronic sedentary lifestyle and living. So in this case, we have to get moving, and we have to find a way. Not only that, but there's a part of the pelvic floor diaphragm relationship that is totally missing from the textbooks. It's missing from our conversations as therapists. And we have no freaking idea how impactful this system is in our body in terms of affecting everything. It is the pumping mechanism for every fluid in our body that isn't attached to a pump, which the only one that we know of is like that's attached to a pump is our heart. But as far as other processes in our body, if you think about the expansion and compression of the space between your diaphragm and your pelvic floor,
Hmm.
and how that's also working to stabilize and support neutral positioning and improve neural drive with functional movement. Uh, it's a pump. It is a pump. And the expansion and compression of that pump is what's mobilizing the cerebral spinal fluid, lymphatic fluid, venous blood. It's the, this in the cerebral spinal fluid. And if you look in ancient Chinese texts, that's what they understood this. They talked about the lumbosacral pump and the cervical cranial pump, and they have mechanisms of understanding how these things work
So
and operate.
like a cat cow kind of motion where you're
In
going
essence,
into
well, essentially, when your head is when you're in protracted position here and your head's out in space, and you
right.
come into this position, this is a pump. This is a cervical cranial pump, right? So if I inhale here and I exhale here, and if you notice, there's a commonality with yoga poses and these different things that are it's, in a sense, it all is tied to the same paradigm. And you notice that one of them is this, and one
Hmm.
of them is this, and the same thing goes for the anterior and posterior pelvic tilt.
Yep.
Um, but then you notice too how these movements of the core affect everything in the body, and the idea is that, you know, we're just tubes, right? And your spinal cord is just a tube. It's a cord. It's a tube, and it needs to, it doesn't it, the straighter it is, the more it can pass information effectively, right? Just like a hose being straight and unkinked is going to pass more volume of water less restricted, right? So the idea is that neutral positioning is also where the spine itself, the foramina in the spine and the spinal canal itself, are at their biggest and broadest openings, which account for less pressure and impingement and different things of that nature. And then you think about the fact that the spine isn't just stacking on top of itself like we've always thought. We're actually suspended. Like there's some
Mhm.
tensegrity. Like Thomas Myers is a revolutionary thinker. I've been practicing Thomas. I just found out about Thomas Myers this year. Can you believe this? I mean, this dude.
I'm not familiar. What's
Have you heard of
Thomas
functional
Myers?
patterns?
Yes.
They've want functional patterns is uh, it's naughty taking what he learned from Thomas Myers as an individual and rolling it into a full program. It is Thomas Myers. Functional patterns is Thomas Myers. It's not
Gotcha.
naughty, but it's naughty's the flat. He kind of put a brand in the face and made it what it is. But Thomas Myers is the guy that is the originator and the founder of the principle of tensegrity, of the idea behind the fact that we're a balance of suspension and compression. And but what's funny is, like I said, I've known this without even knowing him or this or anything, just based off my own experience, and probably similar to the way he came across it, which was through his own clinical practice and these feelings and ideas about how things are operating that doesn't really match what we're seeing in modern textbooks. And but the book that you need to look into, it's called Anatomy Trains Just Like a Train.
Okay.
um, and Thomas Myers' work is it's profound in terms of the fascial slings in the body. The If you look at the locomotion of the body and how it serves itself for efficiency in terms of the rebounding capacity of the body, how it rebounds off itself as the body kind of counter rotates. There's a natural tissue loading that essentially makes there's less metabolic demand. And we're built so beautifully to harness and to use these fascial slings in our body, and it matches the PNF patterns and the different, the different neurologic scapular patterns and pelvic patterns that have been so familiarized in our thinking. And so, getting back to the question of the sensitization, the whole idea here is that we need to identify the body is a is a it's a tensegrity system. It's a balance of tension and compression. That you have to realize that there is a fluid. Um, we're tubes, right? So we have to
Mhm.
mobilize fluid. It has to move. We need all these different types of fluid in our body to not get hung up. That's that simple. You back up a pipe, you're gonna have a problem. So that's another thing. So the way we do that is understanding that, well, what's affecting fluid mobility? Well, number one, gravity, right? Gravity is going to push everything down. Um,
Mhm.
and so we need strong pumps to get things up. And so that's one. Two is utilizing and leveraging non-weight bearing exercises to address weight bearing issues, right? So you're going to be able to perceive and feel things much deeper whenever you're not bound by um, when you're not also holding yourself up against gravity. Think about all the information your body has to use and your nervous system has to use to just provide the static support of keeping you upright. That's a lot of, even though we've kind of desensitized to it, it's a lot of work. So
Sure.
I've always liked the idea of using the ground and using non-weight bearing things in terms of the floor itself, the transitions, the functional movements that we really have lost due to the fact that we don't live our lives on the floor anymore. Because it's very intuitive and it's very easy for a person to tap into some of the intuition, right? So a lot of the knowledge that you have about your body and how it can move is based off of you putting yourself in a position to learn from yourself to uh, and to work on a process and a focus uh, on feeling good, on creating movement and sensations that actually feel good, and being willing to explore those areas. That's kind of my deal, and desire. My desire is to really help people connect with self healing, self care, how to manage and to love yourself, and to fix yourself, and to have the confidence to do so, and really just giving them some ground rules and structure, and some and giving them the okay, and helping them to build belief in themselves. And as a practitioner, I think there's so many guys that are really, and that's the part of even where with my message, it's probably a little confusing because I kind of look and smell and sound a lot like some of these guys, but I'm not. In the fact that I'm concerned with helping people develop personal sovereignty, and I don't care if it comes from acknowledging me or if I get credit for it. Even it doesn't matter if I'm making an impact on the world. It's not based off of how many people acknowledge that impact. It's based off of me knowing that impact and being proud of it. And at the end of the day, the more people I can help, regardless of whether I get credit or not, that's my objective. You know, I want to see lives change, and I want to know that there's that people have more tools and resources. And all I'm doing is resurfacing ancient wisdom. I'm not talking about things that aren't really haven't been studied and understood for thousands and thousands of years, but for some reason we feel like our knowledge and modern medicine practices and how we've been manipulated. Their culture has been so manipulated. They don't that we're in a position now where we're still in denial as a culture on how bad we've been raped, in a sense, how bad we've been manipulated and controlled. The pharmaceutical industry, it's almost disgusting. I'm sure there's doctors out there that sit there and I think if you've been prescribing pills based off of pharmaceutical sales reps recommendations and advice, and you find out that those pills you've been prescribing have been killing people, how do you come to terms with that, right?
Yeah,
Legally, personally, spiritually. Like, we like, in a sense, like, you either a you double down on why you're doing what you're doing, and commit to it because it's making you a lot of money, and it's accounting for your nice house and you're paying for your kids private school, or you have a come to Jesus and you realize that there is a better way. Just like organic farming, there's a better way. I mean, we
sure.
can monocrop culture this world and rape it, you know, or and there's when we can eat that food and it seems the same, and you know, and we're we don't get too hung up on that, and we, as long as we don't have to see it. But reality is that everything we do has consequences. Every behavior we take has consequences. Our thoughts, and our actions, you know, they all matter. And
Speaking of farming, did you watch that? I think his name is Will Harris. That recent
yeah,
Rogan
oh,
episode
that's so good.
for the dude from White Oak Pastures.
Oh yeah, dude, it's so
Oh, he
good.
is the man. But there's so
Oh yeah,
much.
remind me of Colonel
There's
Sanders.
so many parallels to kind of what we're talking about with health and physical wellness. His description of complex systems versus complicated systems, I thought was awesome.
Mhm.
Where
Yes.
complicated system, you're thinking of it as just this machine with a ton of different parts. One part breaks, you take that part out, you put another one in. Whereas a complex system, there's got to be homeostasis with the entire organism. As one thing breaks, everything else adapts to it. So that just really reminded me of that. The way
It's
you're talking
holistic.
about, exactly the system, the way we live our lives, and the way we address training and pain as well. So, along the lines of empowerment, what would you do to empower an athlete that's presenting with these chronic pain sensations or symptoms that may be from hypersensitization?
You confront them, and how you do that is it's just a little bit deeper. It's a little more. Um, it has to be a little more thought out, and so obviously, I've seen your page and I've seen how you've gotten a lot of benefit from Ben Patrick's program, and and what Ben Patrick's done so well is the same thing that I'm kind of doing in a different way. I guess in a different way, is is really exposing people to ancient wisdom. You
Mm-hmm.
know, he credits Charles Poliquin with his with a lot of the information that he really is leveraged and utilized in his program, and he's resurfacing. He's not trying. I mean, in essence, he's not saying I'm. He's not in. None of us. We're not inventors. We're improvers. We're really all we can do is take information of our predecessors and try to make more of it and try to do better and try to think of ways to of really leveraging uh, knowledge as it stands today and building upon
Yeah, that's what creativity is.
exactly. It's no nothing new, um, and we're just getting inspiration from each other, and we're learning from each other, and we're in a time and culture where we can do things like this and share information, develop deeper relationships, influence more people, and I think that's really the key to the time that we're in now is for people of influence to truly embrace these concepts of and really get rid of these the dogma that gets tied to the labels we form around systems and I had a person from a go-to coach comment on a post I did that was really just kind of a it was speaking on mindfulness and I want to say it was just a clip of me like doing a headstand or something silly and but it was really
Mm-hmm.
more like the message of me talking in the background about how you know we need to develop practices and different things of that nature. And he jumps on my post and says, "You need to hire a go-to coach," you know. And I'm like, "Wow, you know, like how bold, you know." And
Yeah,
I just thought, I think that speaks to something deeper. It was probably somebody who's just freshly into it, and he's all adhered to the tribal mentality and
right.
and you could build community behind that tribal mentality, but yet you're going to really steer people into a lot of negativity as an unintended consequence. And so that's really the balance I found is trying to really think about how do I step into this space because I've avoided Instagram and personal branding and everything else for almost 7 years. And
Mm-hmm.
even though I have always had a lot to say, and I've always really um, felt like I had an obligation to share information with the broader public. But in a way, too, I was very careful to make sure that I could refine my ideas and to feel like the messages I was spreading and who I am as a man, as a person, have been like in a sense have been through the cauldron of figuring out through life's adversity what's right, what's wrong, and what do I really want to promote and believe in and stand behind.
Right.
And so that's kind of the you have a lot of influencers with massive influence that are even to this day. You got to think these things are evolving, and the this knowledge that Ben Patrick's sharing is knowledge that people in my setting have had um, for years, but most have chosen to ignore. Um, but through personal exploration and through practices of my own, I've been practicing knees over toes as an unintended consequence. My focus was always to build a solid pattern and foundation based off of like a neutral base of support. And then once you
Mm-hmm.
build that foundation, then you immediately start to progress the lunge pattern into and you start to really force and develop in range stability. Think about you have point A, you have point B. We're only walking. I'm only operating in this range, but I'm doing it frequently, and people have this perception of work and the volume of work, and you say, well, you know, we need to get your legs stronger, and they say, well, I walk this much a day, and I'm like, that's not what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Or I do this, or I work in the yard, da, da, da. And I'm like, that's not what we're talking about. That's not thinking about there has to be an opposition to the stress that you're under day by day. But also, when it comes down to this myofascial uh, system that we're talking about in terms of how these fascial slings in the body and how these systems work, it's all based off of function. So our bodies are designed to function a certain way. And the best way to really encapsulate that is to think about the developmental cycle. And that's something Gray Cook said uh, way back in the beginning, and I remember thinking that was profound. But developmental neurobiology itself tells you that when you look at the building blocks in the neurodevelopmental cycle, the sensitization that forms as in pediatric patients, and you see how you address and confront those problems, it doesn't change. We're just big babies, and we tend to fall down the ladder that we climbed up. um, we tend to develop avoidances and hypersensitivities that are mild and minor, but they go kind of
Mm.
unnoticed. We develop movement adaptations because our fascial system allows for a lot of discrepancy, right? But the thing is, to strengthen that fascial structure and system and to get deeper into really addressing these problems, we have to sit on our feet. We have to uh, put these two joint muscles in at their end ranges. For instance, your rectus femoris it can extend your knee and flex your hip, and it can actually do both at the same time. Or it can do the reverse order of either. Your hamstrings are two joint muscles. Your your the psoas muscle, as it attaches to your lumbar spine at multiple segments and crosses to your hip, has a giant impact on your pelvis and your lower spine positioning and function. Um, these are these are all things that I think, in essence, that program, the program itself, is kind of helping to cover and discover that these neutral positions, we're only addressing these small ranges. Now we have to attack this side, and now we need to make
Right.
sure we're addressing the bodies and the tissues in a fuller expression of strengthening tissues at their absolute endpoints, not just in their shortened states, and then also looking at how these systems work in totality through function, from getting on the floor to standing up to walking to running to jumping, to skipping, to moving laterally, to rotating, to turning, to throwing. To and you have people in their life that say, "Well, I'm not a thrower, so why do I need to work PNF patterns and different things of that nature?" Because your body is designed for these tasks. You might not be throwing, but your lat and your entire shoulder complex is a deceleration mechanism, and the fascial structures of your that anchor your shoulder to your pelvis are a part of that system as well. And so a lot of the things I explore is based off of getting into the upper quarter and looking at you can take a lot of the fundamental patterns and break it into the most simple form. And a lot of what I do, especially working with fighters, utilizing Bulgarian
Mm.
bags and paraballs and Indian clubs, and looking into the ancient wisdom, and then tying it into modern knowledge, and looking at how to restore and harmonize these neuromuscular patterns as a means of efficiency and recruiting the body as a whole system. and
Right.
and again, by doing so, you're by nature diverting attention from that problem area of pain. And so you do that in the most the body craves variety. It craves a
Absolutely.
multitude of sensations from a multitude of different positions, and you get hung up on one, you can move to another. And so in dealing with an athlete specifically, you have to kind of, in a sense, what a good trainer or a good coach, good PT, your job is to expose weaknesses and imbalances. But with athletes, a lot of times, and even in working with performance coaches, as I do now, because my big market is guys like you, it's guys that are trainers and coaches, and even therapists or chiropractors or athletes themselves, and try to help them insert and identify different modalities, ground-based modalities.
Hmm.
uh, Basics of what I feel like is human performance is tied to how we track and observe our hand through our environment. And also, I've noticed that even in the highest level of athletes, I've noticed avoidance to, um, for instance, if you have somebody track their finger as far as they can in one direction and you track them in another direction, you'll notice, yeah, you'll see a limitation in movement a lot of times. And what you don't notice is that the eyes are losing track of the finger. That unintentionally, that person is losing the ability to actually maintain focus on a single point of their body through an entire observable space. And there's going to be portions in that of that they're actually demonstrating things similar to neglect, right? To where it's like there's a loss of connection to this portion of their body through a space of motion and time. So there's a deeper thing that goes on that isn't identified. But if you think about it, we are only really going to be conscious of the portions of our environment that we're accessing. So how many Americans are spending any time going into full spinal extension to where their head
Right.
and their or extension and rotation where they're sitting on their butt, posting out on a hand, and then reaching back and over into these positions that are really, think about your vestibular system, which is informing your 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 brain where your body is in relation to your head at all times. If we're not considering that system with these other things we're doing, then we're losing track, because that is an overarching system where if there's dysfunction, nothing else matters. If your vestibular system is whacked out and you have issues with your head, where you're having sensitivity or issues like achieving head positions in relation to your body,
Hmm.
or your eyes being unable to look behind you, or look above you. And if you think about your brainstem reflexes, they're all rooted in triggering automatic movement responses to peripheral information. So your reticular activating system and these systems in our brainstem that cause us to look quickly based off of our evolution, where there was a point in time where our ancestors had birds of prey and things that were trying to eat them, or they were
Right.
encountering, that made it to where those traits passed on through to us, right? Our ancestors were the winners. um, and so if you really think about
Yeah,
it.
we're not looking up and out very much anymore. It's just down and at our phones.
Exactly. And so we're losing so much of the innate abilities that we've been gifted with from our ancestors' experiences, and from the fact that, if you think about it, they've really endured and overcame for us to be here today. Like, for us to be here right now having this conversation over technology and sharing ideas and talking about probably our common ancestors, right? And
Yeah,
and
it's impossible to even fathom how crazy that is.
we were built based off of their experience, right?
Right.
And so that's something we have to really respect and remember, that we're not that special, and that a lot of what we are and who we are and where we've how we've gotten here, it's a collective, and it's not individual. And there's a portion of us that needs to really embrace and acknowledge these things, because it's what's going to allow us to grow even farther and to expound and evolve, to the in a sense to where the next generation can get there quicker. And a lot of this information, this evidence-based work that we're talking about, this effective tools and modalities and the way we address and treat the body, become standard practice. And a lot of the functional training and the conditioning, and it includes elements of understanding in terms of the desensitization. And I'm sure with your experience, you've noticed that the things you were avoiding and adapt and I guess modifying, were the things that you were continuing to suffer and deal with. And so there's a portion of,
Definitely.
we have to implement the sports psychology, and we have to understand there's elements of the same avoidance that fibromyalgia sedentary person experiences in a different way. It's the same thing, but it's just in a different context, a different lens that you have to kind of look at this thing through. And like that sedentary lady with the thyroid problems and the fibromyalgia, well, for her, it's probably the fact that sitting and standing isn't being acknowledged as a thing, as far as when she's going to her ortho. he's acknowledging she has to get on and off the toilet. She has to get on and off the chair. She has to get in and out of the car. So she's sitting and standing and squatting. She's going from a sit to stand, 20 to 30 times a day, irregardless of
Right.
her pain. So she's going to have, if she has an issue or a back problem or a neck problem, that means that she is constantly modifying and adopting and we aren't conscious of the way we've, I guess, amended and modified our movements to avoid pain. So much of that happens subconsciously. Most of what we're treating is the adaptations people have made to avoid the pain that they're experiencing. And when you think about
Exactly.
that, now we're dealing with we have to confront there's an automated pathologic movement pattern in place that we have to confront and address and get down to. And that's the work we're doing. It's really trying to, and even in that Neovertoe program, a lot of it is based off of progressions to develop. Uh, um, it's not even the fact that you're developing mobility in a lot of sense. You're reducing the sensitivity, and you're down regulating your autonomic tone in ways to allow you to access farther and deeper ranges of motion, without your alarm system going off and saying, no, you're going to break something.
Yeah.
And you have to do that
That's
methodically.
a that's definitely a total reframe that I had to make was kind of seeing everything as brain and nervous system training.
Yes. Every,
Because yeah, you want to get so focused on, I got to get as strong as possible in this movement, but that's actually counterproductive if you're setting off the smoke alarm in your brain that this is a dangerous exercise when the entire point is to desensitize that range of motion.
and I also realize that there's a portion of that dangerous, dangerous exercise. There's a portion of
Right,
that
perceived danger.
that you can experience. There's portions of that range of motion that don't bother you. But there's
Right.
something in us that says, like, well, and I'll have patients all the time, and I say, like, well, when I move my shoulder, it hurts. And I'll say, okay, well, what exactly are you doing? And they're like trying to make it hurt. Like they have to prove to me that their shoulder
Right,
hurts, and
right,
look, it hurts. Look, I promise, if I do this, it's this thing.
right.
It's like, oh, see, yeah, right there. You feel that click, or you see that? Like, is that okay?
Yep.
And it's like we're waiting to. I mean, in a sense, it's like I got a headache, so I got a brain tumor. Like, boom. What
Yeah,
we have to realize is our beliefs, our thoughts on things become who we are, and the way we're reacting to our pain is a sense that's the most important information. So what we're doing in a sense with a lot of these down regulation techniques is we're putting ourselves in a position to observe this information, observe the pain in a way where I'm not running from it. I'm exposed to it to an
yeah,
extent that I can sit here and still breathe. But now I get into a point where, how do I know what's too far? Well, every movement
yeah.
happens.
Graded exposure.
Right. So, from my experience, what I do is I structure movement within a breath cycle. And when the breath cycle is interrupted, I'm hoping to train people to acknowledge and notice that. That's it.
Hmm.
Not to change it, to notice it, and to get better and better and better at noticing when they change their breathing pattern based off of a portion of motion or a range of motion or a specific motion. And to me, your intuition is tied because that's the thing you can identify. You can identify if you can identify if there's a portion where you're going,
Right.
you know, in a sense, that's
Yeah.
your key right there to stop, to reframe, reset, reorganize. Okay, that's what I can do unrestricted, and this is what I can do. And in a sense, so you're building cycles and loops of successful repetitions and successful outcomes that aren't tied to this that guarding
Yep.
trigger, that pathologic apprehensive co-contraction that you're trying to train your body out of, because the pain that I notice people are under is based off of how the body's fighting itself, how it's co-contracting, how it's protecting, and we don't even know that it's there until we release it. once you let it go, it's like, oh, I had no
Yeah.
connection to that guarding, and and that's where giving people the benefit of the doubt and really listening and trying to work with people that were being dismissed, I've learned that they're not quite in control of the things that they think they're in control of. And that tone and that tension that they're using to protect, and the reason that they're not breathing and their valsalva and maneuvering and through all these things is they're utilizing the air pressure they can create through that valsalva to give them a pseudo stability, which is preventing their core from ever having to actually operate properly. And so
Mm.
if I can't fix the breathing dysfunction, I'm not technically fixing anything, because if they have to stop breathing in order to perform this motion, well, that's the
It's
vital life
pointless.
source, right? That's how
Yeah. Yeah.
oxygen and carbon dioxide is getting exchanged through their bodies. So in a sense, if they're allowing that to take, if they're putting that on a shelf to accomplish this movement, then we're deprioritizing the fact that the primordial movement of that's occurring through this cycle of expansion and compression of the diaphragm and the pelvic floor, this respiration, this pumping system, that's the negative pressure source to drive the lymphatics, right? So we think about peripheral movement as a source of mobilizing lymphatic fluid, which is what's removing all the waste products from our body. In reality, it's not as affected as it is based off the central pump. This compression, this expansion and compression is drawing and creating a negative pressurization that is actually pulling and assisting fluids out of our body. And so
Mm-hmm.
this movement pattern that is kind of like, it's dismissive because we're thinking about the ankle and the knee joint and the hip joint, and we're forgetting that ultimately, if we're not understanding that when I take a deep breath, I put my psoas and my hip flexor on a bit of slack. As I go into a bit of an anterior tilt, my spine goes into a bit of extension. And when I go into a deep compression, I'm having to kind of posteriorly tilt that pelvis. I need to kind of elongate the front of that hip. I need to, and you can really feel and perceive these connections into the pelvis and the lower spine, and there's an effect that has on the whole upper half, and understanding the ways that the spine is adapting from these foundational changes, and then challenging things in a way where, like that, the the kneeling where you kind of prop your foot up on the wall, and you we call them a wall kneel, where
Mm-hmm.
that's a time under tension exposure deal. So it's a flood of information input. Or even, let's say you're just sitting on your feet, right? That seems pretty simple. Well, for instance, Andrew at the Mark Bill podcast, he can sit on his feet all day. His distal quad mobility is beautiful, but his proximal quad mobility is not good, right? So he has, in a sense, a bit of a flexion contracture at the hip, but yet he could do most of the knee over toe program without a lot of problems, but it's not addressing his problem, which is hip and
Mm.
back issues in regards to this. And what's he avoiding? Rotation. Everything moves in one piece, right? So a lot of these
Mm-hmm.
modalities are meant to divert the attention to the breath, to the diaphragm, to the core, to really open and engage and to stimulate motion from the trigger is all from the center, right? And the awareness of the breath, the awareness of this space between the diaphragm and the pelvic floor is a key to unlocking deeper and deeper elements of motion by diverting attention, by preventing co-contraction. I'm moving through
Mm-hmm.
exhalation, right? And you're using the
Right.
power of that exhalation as a means to overcome co-contraction and apprehension,
Right.
and the timing and the sequencing and of these things is everything. And so what we're trying to do is simplify complex things and to put it into achievable, um, I guess you could say, complex. Um, it seems complex because it's multi faceted, but in the same tone, it's simple because the body's very familiar with these things. These are innate, in a sense, you know.
Sure. Yeah. It seems that the breath is kind of the portal into the autonomic nervous system.
Yeah,
So it seems like the best possible place to start for someone that is having these, if you want to call it dysfunction or symptoms that are caused by a nervous system kind of brain issue, that combined with these movements on the floor and the expansion and compression to move that pump. And what was that pump? What did you call that pump again? It's not the lymphatic system, but it's
Sure. Well, it's essentially, it's not well described in modern texts, but the in ancient Chinese texts they described it as the lumbosacral pump. And it's,
okay.
you got a nutated sacrum, you have a extended, I guess you could say, extended spine, and the idea is that you're really squeezing that sacrum downward as you're taking the curvature of the spine and you're kind of flattening it out simultaneously. And in doing so, you're creating, for instance, even if you look at the bow, when you're in a standing position, your lower colon is essentially kind of cinched off. Um,
Right.
as the pelvis is really kind of shifted back, it almost cuts off that lower bow. And whenever you get into a deep squat, it almost creates a solid tube that empties the bow,
Yep.
all right? So essentially, we're meant to evacuate and to poop in a deep squat position. It's advantageous to
Right.
it's how our system's really built. But that's another thing. We sit in a 90 degree position on a toilet, and we wonder why we have, some of the health disparities we have just in related to that matter, right? So this is we said the pelvic floor diaphragm um, mechanism of really, and it's not, in a sense, I guess, when we're doing some even the traditional posterior pelvic tilting and a lot of the traditional mat exercises related to physical therapy, we're doing these things, but if we're not doing them with respect to the breath, then we're not doing it properly. And I can't tell you how many therapists are out there.
Right. You're not addressing the whole system.
No, because it's not done within the loop and cycle of life. Just like the sun goes up, the sun goes down. There's a cycle and a rhythm to every single thing that we experience in life, and we're trying to function outside of those cycles of nature. In respect to the breathing, it is the metronome in which we operate. Each individual has an operating metronome based off of the rate of breathing that is natural and it kind of fits where they are in that place and time. And so,
Hmm.
and if you think about even the to achieve a full breath, right? So it's my my diaphragm, for it to work properly, my abdomen actually has to move outward, right? We're breathing upward. The second
To
I
the
go
chest.
up, I've lost connection to this, right? So if I can't
Right.
start this and then work it upward, and notice where I finish, right? And then notice where I finish, right? So
Hmm.
it's understanding there's a broader primordial stabilization and access we get to our spine and our body through the spinal wave and through this diaphragmatic pelvic floor breathing mechanism we need to develop and harmonize and become familiar with. And we need to spend time with and exposing ourselves to feeling and engaging and understanding this relationship. And what that does is it carries over into everything. It makes everything you do in that knee over toe program more effective, because now you can bind your leg up on that wall. You can flatten yourself back, and you're working on this foldability, which is so important. The body needs to fold upon itself. Or you're working on the reverse Nordic, where we're kind of up and we're on our knees and we're working back into that extended position as we're kind of eccentrically loading our quads. And I love that exercise. It's one of my favorite. And I've come up with a whole series of ways to build off of that linear motion and make it rotational. And that's part of the work I'm doing, is really just trying to think about expanding on some of these things, and then also building them into deeper and deeper, more effective modalities that can address deeper and deeper issues, but also optimize the human form, and realize that there's ways that we can really target these fascial slings. There's ways where we can condition certain patterns of motion, and we can build and harness like massive amounts of. We can change ourselves, and we can build durability in our bodies like we never thought before. The capacity for change in the human body and the capacity for change in the human mind. What we're learning about neuroplasticity and understanding deeper elements about how the mind and the body and the brain are interfaced. We're in a paradigm shift, big time. Things are getting out of this linear Newtonian mindset, and they're moving into this quantum physics.
Yeah,
We understand
um, I agree completely.
there's a dynamic nature to our lives and our bodies, and I think through that exploration, we actually learn more about the universe itself. There's information inside of us that is,
You get more connected to the whole
yeah.
on many different
Well, you
levels.
understand there's patterns, and yeah, you might not understand the other side, but once you understand the pattern, you can make better and better generalizations to the whole.
Right.
Yeah.
So, what along the lines of knees over toes exercises are you using in clinical practice as well as for the people that the athletes that you're training?
The split lunge position has been a cornerstone from day one because it's tied into a lot of that FMS programming. And then
Hmm.
I realized really early you could just take a split lunge position like a kneel, and then you could alter and modify, in a sense, like in respect to the spinal position. If you can maintain neutral positionings, and you can really push your base of support farther and farther to where you can really, I guess, in a sense, move into a what's considered like a knee over toe position, in a way. That's how you would translate and transfer to, if you were kneeling on your right knee, that's how you would essentially transition and transfer to your left knee without having to stand all the way up and kneel all the way back down, right? So the idea is that there's a forward progression of that knee over that toe to the point where you can actually roll that knee down to the ground and step forward with the opposite foot. And that's kind of a wrestling transition in the way that I adopted it, or kind of stumbled.
Yeah, what do they call that? Isn't it like a duck walk or
Yeah,
something?
we call it
There's like a name for the movement
we
pattern.
call it duck walk, monster walk. We call it walking lunges or transitions, and um, it's irrelevant, I guess, as long as you get to the same effect.
Yeah,
But the idea is that you're practicing transitions with the lower half while you're maintaining spinal integrity, and that's really going to challenge your core strength, but it's also going to develop amazing mobility at your ankles, your knees, and your hips. And if you think about even the yoga poses and transitions, if you look at yoga and as it's been practiced and stigmatized, and you look at the practice of yoga and you go through a series of experience, as you gain experience in that, you realize that everything that we're popularizing in modern day has been addressed in the yoga practice. These positions and transitions and all these different things, they're all kind of being addressed in a sense. Obviously, when you look at some of those positions and the way and some of the tools and the way we can utilize external forces, now we can push things a little farther. But at the core of it is really rooted in ancient wisdom. There's always some ancient wisdom attached to these modern day things that, once you really look into it, it's a recycling of this knowledge. And I've always thought of it that way, and really thought of the source of information of thousands of years of Chinese medicine, or through Eastern thinking, and looking at those tools that they were leveraging and the way that they understood energetic exchange in the body,
hmm,
and also acknowledgement of a spirit and a soul, and of a being, of a conscious being that is separate from our physical bodies. That's all part of the I guess the envelope of the things that we've dismissed because it was counterintuitive to the Newtonian thinking of modern day.
right.
It took power out of, perceivably, it took power and control out of our hands at some point, and we started dismissing and discrediting these things. And you could see humans have done that throughout, you know, human civilization. We're destructive creatures, and and we're suppressive and control based creatures, and society is basically made up of a lot of assumptions that the people within that society don't have the intelligence and capacity to care for themselves, and we've become codependent on
Yeah, we monetize fear and dependency, so it's
yep.
it's money driven, and those are the two easiest sources to exploit.
That's exactly right. And as far as the Neo program, though, it's in a sense a person in my world. It's again, it was for me. I thought it was great because it was a simplification and it was a packaging of some tools and modalities that were able to really yield high level results through uh, the same mindset of exposure to parts and places that have been avoided, and intuitively, if you think about that, that's kind of where you end up stumbling upon and moving to, is to a lot of those programs where you're really thinking about how to develop tissue integrity and tolerance past neutral into those 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 loaded ranges that were always considered to
Right.
be like the no-no places. But why? Because we're looking at lines of gravity, we're looking at our body as if it's this mechanical structure where the bones are kind of stacked upon themselves and there's just this massive amount of compression. But like I said, again, if you think of the body as a tension compression system where there's suspension girdles, like this trap muscle is actually a suspension system, just like on a bridge, right? It's just a girder that comes down and anchors the shoulder to the neck and head, and it keeps it suspended in space like a bridge, right?
Mhm.
And so that's just one example, but that's kind of the nature of our body. We've always kind of thought of it as just a skeleton of bones just stacked upon itself, and the way we've analyzed movement and biomechanics has always been based off of that kind of thinking, and it's wrong. It's not a proper. It's we weren't it's not well thought out, and I think that's what's cool about all this is how in a way it's causing like, whoa, it works. Clearly, look at all these cases of successful outcomes, and
Mhm.
look at these guys' movements, and oh wow, they're jumping, and that man, they're dunking, and they're doing things that
Yeah.
like what. And but then you could take a guy like, I don't know if you watched the podcast with Qatar. Was it Qatar?
Oh,
The
yeah.
guy that
Uh,
um,
uh, Ziani,
Ziani.
I think is his last name.
Yeah, Qatar is
That guy's incredible.
he's
But
unbelievable,
that
right?
can kick the
He
basketball
can
out of
kick the
the
yeah, he can kick
rim.
the, yeah, he can kick himself in the head, and like he can dunk. He's 45 years old, taught himself how to dunk after an Achilles tear. And
Yeah, I used to watch his stuff back in high school when I'd get hyped up to train for my, windmill dunk,
right.
and he's a
Well,
beast.
now think about his path to getting the same information, right? That same information that Ben Patrick discovered through Charles Poliquin in his effort to heal and to deal with his knee and the expectations that were placed on him by his community to become this star athlete and to be somebody important and significant along with his wife. Those that magical formula of those things resulted in him uh, really pushing himself in a way to kind of stumble upon the same concept and achieve the same results, let's say. And
Yeah,
through Qatar's process, um, it was all inward. It wasn't based off of him seeking information from external sources. He found a process of spending time with himself and spending time on the floor developing those six different positions that he kind of has named uh, based off of his experiences and things like that.
yeah,
But if you notice, those are all modalities and they're all positions that essentially encourage the same thing: time under tension, developing those deeper ranges. We've There is this concept that there's tension and there's mobility, and that there's a there, like stiffness is good. I saw a post the other day. It was talking about ankle stiffness, and it was talking about
right,
how
like functional stiffness.
stiffness, right? And
Yeah,
that's the wrong word, right? It's not. We are not trying to encourage stiffness. Is not the word. when you create motion and mobility, you're actually like, there's this idea that somehow you're going to create laxity, which is going to somehow create a space for injury, right?
Right.
And it's
Or lack of performance.
right, and it's not how the body works. We're built off of timing and again, that tension integrity system. So you think about it, we're built um, to create the appropriate amount of tension to in response to the ground forces and the things that we're interacting with. But that tension doesn't have to be there before that. In a sense, our body has the ability, and Thomas Myers talks about, you ever seen a cornstarch and water kind of experiment where you get that little putty matrix and it's like you touch it and your finger kind of sinks down into it, but if you slap it or you punch it,
Mm,
it just rebounds off, right? So in a sense,
yeah.
as the body loads itself, it becomes stiffer, or more tension is generated that supports that motion as you get deeper and deeper into that range. So for instance, if my joint's in this nice neutral range, there's not a lot of tension there, right? But as I straighten my finger, I'm provide my body naturally creates a tension and a stabilization of that joint because I'm pushing it to its in range capacity. Same thing on this side. As I push it
Right.
farther and farther down, I create more and more tension, which is providing more and more integrity laterally at this joint. As I go down, I can't move it lateral. The farther I go down, the less capacity to move this joint laterally, right? But in the middle, oh, I can put a lot of lateral stress on that joint to the point where I could may even be able to create some damage, right?
Right.
The idea is as I move it into those end ranges, there's a tension and there's a torsional mechanism to movement and the way our body functions, just like a double helix. It's a spherical spring loaded system, and we have to totally reframe the way we think about biomechanics and kinesiology and all these different things, and the way the training and the movement is really being developed at this point is based off of a whole different series of things that I'm almost hesitant to get all the way into because it could be another couple of hours.
So along the lines of training, one thing I've seen a lot on your Instagram, there's kind of this like it's like a foot kick where you're rotating to the inside.
Mhm.
What's going on there? Will you explain that a little bit?
So it's like what I would call is a post pivot movement, or essentially.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you think of the mechanics of throwing, hitting, um, turning, anything related to that, and think about, we're built to throw. We are built to essentially turn and move across our bodies, across the midline. So the idea is that if you break it into the most simple form, there's a post and a pivot. And what happens is we spend our whole lives we're starting here, and we're posted essentially on the back leg, and we're kind of
Hmm.
loose and pivoted on the front leg, and then that transitions to where now the front leg becomes the post, the back leg becomes the pivot. So we shift now that front leg is a post, it's a braking system. It has to stop and decelerate the body from moving forward. So as that back leg drives forward and pivots forward, everything can be released. As the back side is coming back, the front side comes forward. And so there's an exchange. And so what I've really focused on is trying to develop athletes in a way where they're breaking into the other side. And
Okay.
they're using flow mechanisms like a Bulgarian bag or any swinging, uh, anything that you can really swing properly, and you're developing a sense of how you're grounding yourself through these transitions of post pivot, post pivot, post pivot, and you're teaching the body how to appropriately turn to either side effectively, and you're reorienting the body the to the other side of the environment. So now everything goes from left to right, and then right to left, and then left to right, and then right to left. And essentially, I'm trying to help people accidentally stumble upon these things without me having to meticulously drive them in with words and things of that nature. So the language of the body is sensation. So the idea is that
Mhm.
as a coach, I need to help people experience individualized learning experiences, which is what's going to carry over. And anything that I'm saying isn't really going to do that. What they feel is what will remain, and what they can connect to, and what they can actually build off of. And so a big part of this is actually trying to get cueing down and to try to
Mhm.
simplify cueing instead of thinking about, oh, extend and rotate and da da da. Make a
Yeah,
big
make it more
arc.
intuitive.
Reach as far out as you can. Make an arc. Make a rainbow. Like, use simple words that create images of the actions we're looking for. And I don't know if you've read Rob Gray's book, How to Move, or heard about it, but essentially, it's kind of it's funny because I started listening to this and I'm like, this is it. This is where things are going. It's about as we stop trying to. For instance, I could sit here and teach you all the mechanics, and we can go back and forth about the ankle, the knee, and the hip, and the biomechanics, and the muscles, and the structures, and this and that. Or I can take all that out of the picture and just spend that same time with you, helping you navigate a movement experience. And in doing so, you're going to get all the results and outcome, and it's going to be individualized without any real need to have a deeper understanding, because it's unnecessary. It's a distraction or a diversion. And you could
Right.
always backlog, you can always pick up information, you can always gain that education. But the problem is that we're conditioning ourselves to need words and to format the understanding before we can actually begin to experience things. And again, the body's language is sensation. So if I'm overly focused on me having a firm understanding, that's a different portion of your brain. That's the narrative generating portion of your brain. It's the
Right.
anti-flow generating portion of your brain. And so, in a sense, that's a portion of our existence and experience that we're trying to reformat how we're training and accelerate the rate of growth and accelerate the rate of carryover by deprioritizing the way we're exchanging information and how much priority we're putting on trying to make sure that a person, um, the need for all this additional information isn't it maybe that's a part of the problem, is that we have to understand everything before we take one step forward. In
Yeah.
reality, the only way we change our brains is through our experiences and execution of something physically. I have to move towards it. I have to take action. And so we're developing habits and behaviors that are action oriented and less stuck in the head. When you're
Yeah.
thinking you're not performing well and your body's not really doing what it needs to. Thinking it can be an enemy in regards to movement.
For
And
sure.
so that's the goal, is try to help reformat and help people find peace in the fact that you can do this differently and it's okay and it's going to yield amazing results, but it's also going to make you feel like you potentially have a little less control, because the
Mhm.
way you're developing a sense of peace and control is through words and information, not through your experience of movement.
So, do you use a more kind of intuitive approach with your periodization and programming for your athletes, or are you that would be my guess, but or do you kind of have a set structure in mind? Because I see a lot of really creative stuff that clearly you're innovating and coming up with as you're experiencing these things with your athletes. But what is that approach that you take for some of the higher level guys that you're working with?
It's 50-50. So I break it into quarters. There's first quarter is ground mobility. And so it's now that can be like, we have our standard set ground mobility, but also amongst that, if I see somebody doing something that's a little different and I'm saying, look, let's explore that. Let's try to integrate that into today, because it's a part of our group, it's part of a session. There's somebody, in a sense, that's an expression that they're having. Let's share that, right? And so it's adaptable and modifiable, but also within the scope of, like, we really want to get all of our work done within like an hour and a half period, because
Hmm.
there's a period that you can really make. So the ground warm up isn't really considered part of that 60 minutes that we're really shooting for, that we want to be really quality, because that can go 15, 20 minutes, and then we transition into kind of the inertia band, parabol, Bulgarian bag is a kind of an addition to that warm up to where now you're taking the ground mobility and the positioning, and now you're moving it into these basic flows that I can just put a bag in their hand, and then 9 out of 10 times, a couple cues, maybe none, and then just say, okay, let's just stay there for a minute. And so you're getting more of this perpetual warm up and flow. You're working the parabol in a figure eight PNF pattern. You're working turning and moving and flowing and developing more complex strategies to do so, more adaptive abilities. And then you're here, and then we're doing the dynamic stabilizations with the inertia bands and the different things to really activate the body in a deeper way. And then from there, we'll transition into more of like functional strengthening conditioning, whether it be kind of farmer walks, whether it be landmine
Mhm.
activities, and usually it's more based off of timing, technique, speed, and optimal position, and then the load kind of goes up from there. And as far as applying like the strengthening loads, I'm really more focused on the really functional strengthening. Like I'd rather have a guy in a trap bar, with 300 pounds on it, walking through space backwards and forwards and sideways, and it's in a way to really build a deeper sense of durability and functional strength. Work, trap bar deadlifts, zerker squats, really functional ways to condition that are also mitigating risk. Like I don't like front bar deadlifts for unless you're a power lifter. It's counterintuitive because you're essentially creating some risk that you can avoid. And even if you adapt to that and you become proficient at that, is it really making you better at the skills that you're trying to acquire? And that's the questions that we need to ask is there some of these things that we're attached to that there's actually better ways, but yet we're still kind of attached to the ways of old, like
Right.
a back squat. I don't do back squat with anyone because I can do a Zerker squat, and yeah, it might be less weight, but what it's and you could still push the load, but there's less capacity for high end load. But for a boxer or an MMA fighter, what if they're squatting 600 pounds? Is that really going to translate to them performing better? I don't think so. I
Yeah.
think versus if they're learning if they're loaded here in the front chain, it's more applicable to the things that they're engaged with and the way that they're operating. And so that's a part of kind of that deeper part of having, we want to build strength, durability, and that kind of conditioning. And then obviously at the end, it's more of a play, so we come into where there's going to be something that kind of lightens everything up and that makes things a little less serious. And we can flow and play, whether it be boxing drills where I'm trying to hit them in the head with the noodles and they're having to slip and
Mhm.
move, and looking at how you can actually develop really good boxing and fighting mechanics throughout these whole systems. We're built for that. Our anatomy is really built to protect us from other humans, and if it's really interesting the way our body aligns itself to protect itself and our movement, and even those post pivot patterns, in a sense they're defensive too. And you're talking about head movement, it's the foot movement, it's the body movement, it's not the head. The head's just a result of the movement that's occurring. So working with fighters has been great, but as far as periodization, frequency always wins. So you doing something twice a day for 10 minutes every day for 2 weeks, and then maybe going to once a day for 10 minutes for the next 2 3 weeks, and then integrating that thing into your life and developing a discipline and a routine with it in a small bite, but very frequently every single day.
Mhm.
That's the key. That's the key to any change. We need lower intensity, higher, more repetitions, and more frequency. So it's not about volume in terms of trying to accomplish too much. We need to take smaller bites each day, and I think that's the key to really perpetuating and to get in the carryover that we're looking for, and also to create individualized experiences. It has to be your thing, not mine.
That kinda aligns with the grease the groove theory, which seems to be a really powerful method for developing skills and strength related skills,
Hmm.
where you're doing kind of a lower volume, something that doesn't even feel extremely challenging, but you're doing it so frequently that you just build this pattern,
Yeah.
uh, and
Matt
it
Winning.
becomes second nature.
Matt Winning is a good friend of mine, but he talks about he does a winning warm up. So there's 25 reps of 3 different exercises that address your weaknesses prior to
Hmm.
whatever it is that you're going to do. And I think that's brilliant. It's a simple way to kind of think about the way you're building in the proper loading patterns, and you're loading the fascial slings in the body in a way where you can really you're doing it at a lighter load, more reps, more volume, but it does lead to strength improvements because you're developing the path, and you're developing
Right.
more neural drive. You're recruiting more of the rest of the body, and you're doing it through sensitivity. Now you're less avoidant to certain. Let's say there's a position there where you're anticipating pain or tightness, how that's going to affect you. But when you can do that at a lower frequency, lower weight, you're giving yourself time to acclimate, and it's going to lead to better results.
Going back to that graded exposure for the body and the brain and nervous system,
That's
it
right.
kind of all lines up with that.
That is right.
The the eye tracking that you were talking about earlier, is that something that you leverage in your training with your athletes, and also how do you leverage that for athletes that have pain?
I'm aware of the eyes more than anything now because I've noticed, like I said, the eyes tell you so much in terms of avoidance, and also what we can access in relation. What we can access with our eyes is going to tell us a lot about our what we can access with our body parts. If you think about it, your entire body is a mechanism to position your eyes in a point of observation to observe the world that we live in. So whether it be me looking behind me, right, or looking up or down, there's a way that that can be transcended all the way through the body. You could stand flat footed facing one direction, and you could look behind you, and you'll notice every single part of your body had to adapt and adjust to allow you to do that. But what it also does is it creates perfect segmental motion. So, for instance, if I'm tracking my finger like this, what's happening is my spine is unlocking in a very specific sequence where it's kind of wringing itself out in one direction in an appropriate order. Rotation's one thing, but we need the rotation to occur in a segment by segment by segment by segment order, in a way where it's sequenced to optimize that motion to where everything has time to clear out its respective space to allow the next thing to move where it needs to go. So it's trying to really simplify that concept and think about this is one of the quickest and easiest ways to do so. But also, if you look at like Andrew Huberman's work, where we're talking about lateral scanning, we're talking about
Right.
um, how that horizontal gazing and movement is going to result in downregulation. Sustained exhalation results in a reduction of the heartbeat as it kind of pressurizes the thoracic cavity. As I inhale, there's actually an increase in the heart rate due to the pressure loss around the heart and how the heart has to kind of adapt. And these are all things that are influencing the autonomic nervous system and my state of excitability, the flight or rest and digest, the place that I'm in, and whether or not that's optimized. It's not just the breathing, it's any sensation can affect the autonomic nervous system in relation to what we're trying to achieve. Reciprocal rotation has the same effect. You can lay on your back, put a Swiss ball under your knees, and just let yourself gently rock that Swiss ball, not looking for like to crack your back, but looking just to like
Right.
move in a rotational pattern where you're crossing midline. Do that for 2 minutes and tell me you can be as stressed as you want to be, and you can do that for 2 minutes and you feel dramatically different. Your blood pressure is going to be a little bit lower. You're going to feel a little bit more grounded, or you're going to feel a little bit more lucid and present. You're going to have you're going to be less in your head even. So there's other elements in terms of windows into the autonomic systems that we can leverage and stack and dose in there, and that's why I love really most of the work that I'm doing. It's almost like I want people to accidentally fall into these things, and because I don't want them overthinking, and so using lateral scanning, crossing the midline, that reciprocal inhibition, is so powerful, and essentially you're trying to create conditions to where a person can experience flow, and they can understand and recognize what that is, and not through their recognition of it, but through them finding more and more space to operate within that efficient state. And it doesn't take much. It doesn't take but one good flow experience before you realize that it is highly addictive, and you want more of it, because
Sure.
it feels so good to feel that freedom when you feel like your
Yeah.
mind and your body is harmonized, and it's working efficiently and fluidly. It's the best feeling, and it's so enlightening and inspiring. And ultimately, that's all we really have is we need hope, and we need to have things that we can do that give us a feeling of significant change in this moment, that can give me hope to embrace this journey tomorrow. And I think it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. So we need consistency. We have to develop disciplines, but we got to do it in small bites that are achievable and that people can feel proud of themselves. It's not about me being proud of you for doing your home exercise program. It's about you being proud of yourself for doing that home exercise program and not needing my validation. You know what I'm saying?
Sure. And those down regulation techniques like the lateral eye scanning and the crossing the midline, are you implementing that before a workout, after a workout,
Everything,
in between?
all of it.
Everything.
Yeah.
Even what about in between sets? Let's say you go to do a heels elevated squat if you're on the knees over toes guy program, and something's feeling a little bit off, and you work through your set, and you're aware of this. You're not, you're reassuring yourself that you're safe, as far as keeping the nervous system down regulated. Would it would it help to then go and do some of these exercises mid set and then come back and see the impact?
Yeah. Or you could even think of it in terms of that split lunge position, or let's just say your a linear motion like the heels elevated squat or the wedge squats. Um, so if you're doing something that is more linear, sagittal plane based, you can think of how can I add transverse motion to this particular thing, right? Um,
To cross the midline?
yeah, and so there's ways to think about like that. For instance, we do something that's similar to that, but then you put a one fist down kind of and block, the inside of, let's just say, your right leg. And now
Okay.
I really look for like an open book type motion where I'm scanning and tracking that finger through there. Or maybe I'm going to take a kettlebell and integrate that where I can do like an single armed overhead press with the same pattern where I could have a balanced squat occurring, but I could really look and turn towards that elevated arm as I'm going down into that squat, and then come back to neutral as I come up, right? And so you're getting kind of a little bit of a side bending, a little bit of a rotation, but you're still in that linear path as far as your foot positioning is concerned.
Yeah.
So that's a part of what I like to do, is just think about how to, because that linear squat does not apply to anything outside of a broad jump. And most people I know, the athletic skills that they're really looking to achieve aren't broad jump related. Even if it's basketball, most of the time you're jumping off of 1 foot, not two. So it's still, again, in relation to the skills and the intentions behind what we're trying to achieve. That's the kind of the bigger picture. But I would like, in ways, I always think of trying to think of any of those linear progressions and always trying to progress them into the transverse plane, and to add more dynamics in terms of how we can identify how we can use the eye positioning in the tracking of our body in space, and totally reframe that same activity into something super, on a whole nother level of complexity, but also there's enough stimulation and information where you don't really have time to focus on your discomfort because there's an optimism.
Right.
Like, if I really post that arm out and I really, really extend that arm straight, and I'm really focusing on trying to just elevate that kettlebell upward and then control it downward, next thing you know, your lower half and the other things that you were kind of overly focused on, they kind of fall out of, they fall out of the way, and everything kind of falls into its respective slot. And that's always been my focus, is just thinking about how to help a person find that experience and not throw the baby out with the bathwater based off of what
Right.
their apprehensions are. And then to give them an opportunity to just be under tension. And it might also be an instance where um, the isometric positioning, for instance, like a split lunge with a 1 inch knee lift, right? So you just get on a knee and you lift that bottom knee 1 inch. And then to me, I don't feel like until a person can sustain that without anything breaking in their posture or alignment for 10 seconds, for 10 reps, they're not really in a position to do anything movement related. Like, it's kind of counterintuitive for me to be having them doing any form of repetitive squatting or lunging or moving and all this friction and dynamics if they don't have the ability to sustain and conditioning to sustain that position for 10 seconds without anything budging. Most people aren't taking the time to even do that form of assessment. And to me, that's the kind of thing that I think we need to be utilizing as a benchmark to give ourselves the leeway to go ahead and progress people. We need reasons for that progression, and it can't be based off of Ben Patrick's programming. It needs to be based off of the practitioner's understanding of what they're doing, what their clients are trying to achieve. And yeah, you can use those activities as benchmarks. They are benchmarks. And essentially, you even say, it's like, for instance, if you can't do a pigeon pose, and you start off on that elevated incline bench, and you could throw your leg up there and you could develop in a less intense fashion and more sensitive fashion what your hip and needs to do, what it needs to achieve, and how your body needs to fold over that leg. And now you
Right.
can slowly progress that to a standard pigeon pose, which is again just a yoga pose that's been around for thousands of years. And so I think even the warrior poses or the lunge positions in yoga, they're all the same thing, and it's based off of creating stability and holding and accessing your breath under bound tension, where you're really growing and you're really finding a deeper sense of yourself. Because I don't care how many times you've done it or what you've done, there's always a portion where you feel yourself trying to cop out, and you feel that negative internal voice trying to convince you that this is going to hurt you, or that something's wrong with this. And in reality, it's all how we lie to ourselves. In a way, we're our own worst enemies, and we're our own. We're in a sense, I think of it like we have God inside of us, and we have this self-deprecating, negative energy that is that can just as easily take over if we allow it.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think that's some great insight for anyone that's on the program and potentially struggling with it. I know one thing, going back to kind of distractions, that helped me was a metronome. And I know that's something that's been used for patellar tendinopathy, but it's again getting that brain distracted in a way. But I really like that idea of incorporating those other movements you were talking about to, one, cause the distraction, and two, um, kind of lean into those modalities that help regulate the nervous system. So I think that's really cool.
Oh yeah.
Um, I think I really appreciate your time. I want to wrap it up here soon. One last thing I wanted to ask about was crawling patterns. So this is a bit more of a self interest question, but I remember on the Power Project you talked about rehabbing kids that were having trouble walking by regressing them to a crawl, to kind of get that cross crawl pattern back ingrained in the brain, and then it manifests as better walking. So I have a niece that was in the hospital that had a heart transplant really early. She was It was over a year that she was in the hospital. So that whole kind of critical crawling time frame was non-existent for her.
Mhm.
She can walk now, but it's with somewhat of a limp. One of her legs kind of drags behind her. And I've always been intrigued with this idea of returning to more basic cross crawl patterns to retrain her brain and watch it manifest in the way that she moves on her feet, because she has the ability to deep squat and get out of a deep squat, which is really intriguing. So it's not a strength limitation, it's just the way things are firing.
Mhm.
Uh, what would your approach be to an issue like that?
Well, I mean, regressions, like you said, are good. You could also take it, and then with children, it's always needs to be play oriented and the more playful and the less
Definitely.
goal oriented it appears to be, the better. And so what I found with youngsters like that, where they seem to have those types of deficits, you can regress and progress them. So doing a single leg position with them holding their knee at 90 degrees and learning how to balance and, oh, well, here, stay here, let's have fun here, or get them in a split lunge position and let here catch these balls.
Right.
This is a fun game. Let's put them on a little balance beam and think about actually differentiating the leg and hip position, which is really counter rotating and moving the pelvis in different directions. Get them turning in a counter rotating fashion, and then stimulating them in different ways, using ways of using balls and tracking, and all these things are so important. The first experience I really had where I knew this was a portion of how I need to reframe my whole career. I had a kid who had been bitten by a pit bull, had his lower leg amputated, and it was the most hypersensitive thing. He was in such a bad place, and then I was just looking how I could really help desensitize this thing because it was the most hypersensitive thing I've ever seen in my life. I could breathe on it, and it would be pain like you
Oh
could
wow.
imagine. He would withdraw it, and then I started looking deeper and deeper into how I could use different tools and went into some neurology books and some pathology books, and I started looking into how to act like and how activating the reticular activate system and using eye tracking and integrating hand eye reactions and catching a ball and throwing a ball and doing these little things, and how it has this amazing effect at downregulating this hypersensitive. And this was literally the key to get this kid in a prosthetic. He had been allowed to he was contractured and hypersensitized for almost 2 years before I even got a hold of him. And so it was a lot of undoing and a lot of trust we had to build because a lot of people broke trust. And but what it showed me is that the more that these things like play, and the more it looks like play, and the more it feels like play, and just the action of me saying, "Hey, stand on one foot and just throw you a ball," right?
Mm,
And just like, whoa, oh, and then you come off of it, and like working on those things in a way with children, especially, it's really miraculous. And so, why don't you try using from the base that and think of that split lunge position as just like a pose,
mhm.
and it doesn't have to be big, it's just staggered, and then work on maybe just kind of like here, touch this, and just reaching it out of her center of gravity, and have her kind of reach and rotate and turn. Go back to the walking pattern, see if it's changed her influence. Change the split lunge to the other side. Let's try it this way. Let's reach up. Let's reach across. And just play with unlocking the body's internal mechanisms in a way where it becomes her internalized learning experience. You could take it into let's practice skipping. Let's practice skipping backwards. Let's go laterally. Let's work on just as many forms of play that can potentially simulate and address some of these things and potentially help unlock a deeper sense of movement for her. It's not as important that we always address a specific dysfunction as it is that we try to unlock a movement experience for her that gives her access to more adaptability,
Mhm.
right? And so, playful ways of exploring that, you're going to learn way more in terms of how you can help her individually just by kind of looking at it from that framework, and then learn from let's try this or let's do this, and maybe let's crawl around and let's play on the floor, and then we'll walk again, see how that works. Let's crawl backwards. Let's work on getting from quadruped to kneeling and just go from quadruped
Mhm.
to kneeling and like play on transitioning in those ways. So um, play and explore, and then look at the don't look at the disability, look at the ability. What can
Sure.
she do? What does she, and how does she do it well? Highlight the things that she does, and identify her superpowers. Like, what did this limitation allow her to develop that other kids don't have? And then
Right.
that's what you hone in on. That's what you build into her, and that's what you show her. And then through that, her confidence and these deeper things, and us not saying like, oh, wow, that's not, that leg doesn't look good, and da da da.
Right.
Now what we're doing is we're framing and teaching her how to overanalyze and to internalize dysfunction instead of ability, you know.
Exactly.
And so I think,
That makes a lot of sense.
yeah, let me know how that goes because I'd really be interested in seeing how she progresses.
For sure. So kind of isometrically with play and some return to the ground.
Yes,
Multi-directional.
because you can freeze a position and you can change the dynamics by you walking around, by giving her a target to touch, by creating
Right.
movement where she has a grounded base of support. And then you can always, modify that and bring that into different positions and ways. Maybe even use some of the wedges and the things in the Neurological program to also challenge the base of support, give it a different feel, give it a different angle, and yeah, and then just take note of those things and just study how she's responding to those different positions because it's easy to study something that's still, right, where I can say the end range of a step is going to lead me here, and now freeze. If I take one step and I freeze on a dime, and now let's play on orienting her around that, right, and then think it instead of a balanced base of support, and now bring that back into motion like a walk. Oh, let's walk. And now that walk periodically, you're just getting a chance to reassess the effect of what you're doing to the thing you're trying to.
Right.
You
Right.
know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Robbie, I won't keep you any longer. I really appreciate your time,
Yeah.
and I really like your outlook, what you're doing for your community, and hopefully you keep putting content out there.
Oh, I will.
I'm definitely on the same wavelength. And do you want to tell people where they can find you, and also anyone locally that is interested in the practice?
Sure. Yeah. Well, you can find me on Movement Doc on Instagram, movement underscore doc. That's really kind of where I put a lot of my stuff out there. I have a website for my physical therapy company. It's Neolife, Neolife, PT.com, neolifept.com. And that's, you can see kind of into our practice and kind of the clinical practice that we're working on here in Mississippi and spreading across the Gulf Coast. And then as far as the resources, like I said, really looking at Thomas Myers Anatomy Trains, looking at Kelly Starrett's The Supple Leopard, looking at Greg Cook's FMS, Functional Movement Systems, um, and even like I said, Rob Gray's How to Move. A lot of great information on there, and and think about ways that you can infuse small portions of these things into your practice without having to understand the whole gamut. Let your experience define and evolve with your learnings. And more importantly, don't feel like we have to figure everything out before we start taking strides forward to take responsibility for ourselves or the clients that we're kind of responsible for working with and the people we're responsible for influencing. Um, and yeah, other than that, I think I'm good, bro.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks for being on, man.
Yeah, man. It was a pleasure.